For years, my life had been a chaotic spiral, tugged along by the twin forces of addiction and petty crime. I wasn't thinking about the future. Hell, I barely thought about the next morning. Then came the day the cops kicked in my door, and my blurry, self-destructive world came to a screeching halt. Arrested. Convicted. Locked away. The cell was cold, the days monotonous, but it forced me to face myself, a version of me I despised. Prison wasn't just a punishment, it was a reset button. Therapy and enforced sobriety forced me to confront my demons. Vomiting in a grimy prison toilet during withdrawal, I hit rock bottom, but it was there, at my lowest, that I felt a tiny ember of something I hadn't known in years: hope. When I walked out of those gates after serving my sentence, I thought I was ready to rebuild my life. Turns out, the outside world wasn't as ready for me. The stigma of being an ex-con was an anchor I couldn't shake. Employers didn't want to hear about redemption. They saw a criminal. Every rejection was another slap in the face, a reminder that second chances were easier to dream of than to find. My parole officer, a no-nonsense woman named Sasha, had a knack for spotting the people who were genuinely trying to turn things around. One day, after another failed job interview, she called me into her office. Her desk was cluttered with case files, but her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. "I know you've been trying," she said, leaning forward. "And I've got a lead. There's a guy named Pete who owns a junk removal company. He's given jobs to guys like you before. It's tough work, but it's honest. Interested?" It wasn't like I had options. "Yeah," I said. "I'll take it." Pete turned out to be an old-school kind of guy, gruff, wiry, and practical to the core. When I showed up at his office, he squinted at me like he could read my entire life story in one look. "You clean now?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," I said, holding his gaze. "Good," he grunted. "This job ain't for quitters. We clear out hoarder houses, eviction messes, and whatever other trash people don't want to deal with. You gonna have to be tough, mentally and physically. Think you can handle that?" "I'll do my best," I said. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but Pete nodded, apparently satisfied. 2 days later, I was wearing the blue, Moving Buddies uniform, standing next to my partner and driver for the day. Devin Baker, or D as he preferred, was one of those guys who looked like life had thrown him through the ringer, and he'd fought his way out laughing. We hit it off almost instantly, bonded by shared war stories from our past lives. "Junk removal ain't glamorous," D said as we drove to our first job. "But it's better than jail." "And Pete?" "He's fair. Tight with money, sure, but fair." "You've been doing this long?" I asked. 2 years, he said. "And let me tell you, hoarder houses? They're a whole other level of messed up. Found some weird shit, man. Rats, mold, even dead pets. Once found a freezer full of decade-old TV dinners. You never know what's hiding in a pile of junk." I laughed nervously, not entirely sure what I'd signed up for. Our job that day was an estate cleanout. An old man had died, leaving behind a house packed floor to ceiling with trash. The smell hit us as soon as we cracked the front door, a foul blend of mildew, rot, and something sour that made my stomach churn. The son of the deceased was there to meet us, an exhausted-looking guy in his 40s. "I'm sorry for the state of the place," he said, shaking his head. "Dad, he got worse in his last years. Said people were spying on him, breaking into the house. I don't know if he was losing his mind or if something else was going on." "That's rough," Dee said sympathetically. "We'll take care of it." As the son left, Dee and I stepped inside, armed with gloves and face masks. The place was a disaster, piles of newspapers, broken furniture, and rotting food. Flies buzzed around lazily, their hum adding to the oppressive atmosphere. And then, of course, there was the smell. "Goddamn," Dee muttered. "This is the worst yet. Let's just get through it," I said, grabbing a trash bag and starting to work. Hours passed as we chipped away at the chaos, uncovering layer after layer of accumulated junk. That's when we found it, the first strange thing. Beneath a pile of ancient magazines, there was a porcelain doll. It was the kind you'd expect to see in a child's room, but this one was different. Its face was cracked, the paint worn away, leaving one unblinking eye staring at us. Its limbs were long and thin, almost grotesque in their proportions. Well, that's creepy as hell, Dee said, stepping back. Yeah, I agreed. Want me to toss it? Nah, Dee said, smirking. Let's call her company security. Every place needs a mascot, right? I propped the doll up on a pile of junk, its blank-eyed gazing out at the room. We laughed it off and got back to work. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like the doll was watching us. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, the house seemed to change. Shadows stretched out like they had a mind of their own, and the faint creaks of the settling building began to feel like whispers. Hey, you hear that? Dee asked, breaking the silence. Hear what? I replied, stopping mid-scoop of a pile of moldy newspapers. Like, skittering. Rats, probably, he said, though his tone carried an edge of uncertainty. We both paused, straining our ears. Sure enough, there it was, a faint scrambling sound, like tiny feet scurrying across the floor. It came from the direction of the living room, where the porcelain doll still sat propped up on her throne of garbage. I swear, if a rat jumps out of here, I'm done, I said with a laugh, trying to shake off the unease. But when we turned toward the sound, the doll wasn't sitting where we'd left it. Dee, I said, my voice shaky. You move that thing? Dee glanced over and froze. The doll was now lying on its side, halfway across the room. Its single unblinking eye seemed to glint in the dim light, almost as if mocking us. Nope. No way, Dee said, backing up a step. I ain't touching that thing. Maybe it fell. Or rats, I suggested, though I didn't believe my own words. Yeah, rats, Dee echoed, clearly unconvinced. Let's finish up and get the hell out of here. We worked faster after that, eager to put the house and the doll behind us. But the strange noises didn't stop. Every few minutes, we'd hear another skitter or a soft rustling from the corners of the room. A couple of times, we found bags of trash inexplicably shifted or toppled over. And the doll? It seemed to change positions every time we looked away. You know what this reminds me of? Dee said at one point, trying to lighten the mood. That movie Poltergeist. Remember the creepy clown doll? Great, thanks for that, I said, tossing a pile of magazines into a bag. Just what I needed, more nightmare fuel. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the house. The tipping point came just as we were wrapping up for the day. Dee had gone out to grab some fresh trash bags from the truck, leaving me alone in the house. I was stacking boxes near the front door when I heard it, a faint jingling sound, like a tiny bell. It was so quiet I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. Jingle. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the living room where the doll had been. I crept closer, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. And then I saw it. The doll was standing upright on the coffee table, its cracked face tilted slightly to one side. Around its neck was a small, rusty bell collar that hadn't been there before. As I watched, the doll's head twitched, the movement so slight I almost thought I'd imagined it. Dee! I shouted, my voice cracking. His footsteps thundered back into the house. What? What happened? I pointed, but when he looked, the doll was back in its original position, slumped lifelessly on the pile of garbage. The bell was gone. You okay, man? Dee asked, frowning. Yeah. Fine, I lied, my hands trembling. Dee glanced at the doll and shook his head. Creepy-ass thing. Let's bag it up and dump it. No way I'm leaving that in here. He grabbed a trash bag and hesitated for just a moment before scooping up the doll. I thought I saw him shudder as he tied the bag shut, double-knotted it, and hauled it out to the truck. Out of sight, out of mind, he said, but neither of us believed it. As we drove away from the house, the tension began to lift. The doll was gone, and we were done with that place. Or so we thought. Halfway back to the depot, Dee slammed on the brakes. What I started, but then I saw it. In the middle of the road, illuminated by the truck's headlights, was the doll. The bag we'd tied it in was shredded, lying in tatters around its feet. Its cracked porcelain face was now completely split, revealing something dark and hollow beneath. The rusty bell collar jingled softly as it swayed in the breeze. Neither of us said a word. Dee put the truck in reverse, but before he could back away, the doll's head jerked upright, and it took a single, deliberate step forward. "Drive," I yelled. Dee didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the truck into gear, swerved around the doll, and floored it down the road. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I kept glancing back, half expecting to see the doll chasing us. It didn't. At least, not that we could see. When we finally reached the depot, we sat in the truck for a long moment, neither of us willing to break the silence. "We're not crazy, right?" I asked finally. Dee stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel. "If we are, we're the same kind of crazy." We decided not to tell Pete about the doll. Who'd believe us anyway? But as I climbed out of the truck, I heard it again, the faintest jingle of a bell. I whipped around, but the parking lot was empty. It was only later, as I was lying in bed, that I realized something chilling. The sound had come from my pocket. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old pipes in my apartment sounded too deliberate. Every shadow in the corner seemed to stretch just a bit too far. I kept replaying the moment we saw the doll in the road, its hollow gaze locking onto us like it knew. Worse, that faint jingling, so close, like it had followed me home, clung to my mind like a fog. Finally, exhaustion won, and I slipped into an uneasy sleep. My dreams were a chaotic jumble of fragmented images, the doll standing at the foot of my bed, its porcelain face peeling away to reveal writhing black tendrils beneath, the rusty bell jingling softly as it crawled toward me on spindly, insect-like limbs, my reflection in the bathroom mirror staring back with wide, unblinking eyes that weren't my own. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The room was silent, save for the low hum of the fridge in the next room. But as I sat up, I noticed something on the nightstand, a small, rusty bell, identical to the one around the doll's neck. The next day, I debated whether to tell Dee. Would he even believe me? Hell, did I believe me? By the time I got to the depot, my mind was racing with excuses for why I hadn't slept. Dee was already there, leaning against the truck, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something colder, edgier. He glanced up as I approached, and I could see the bags under his eyes. "You look like shit," he said. "Thanks," I replied. "You don't look so hot yourself." He didn't laugh. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket and held it up. It was a bell identical to the one I'd found on my nightstand. "This was in my truck this morning," he said, tied to the rearview mirror like some kind of sick joke. My stomach dropped. "What do we do?" "Burn it," Dee said firmly. "Burn the bell, burn the doll, burn the whole goddamn problem." The plan seemed simple enough. We'd head back to the house, find the doll, and destroy it for good. But as we drove, the sense of dread in the air grew heavier. The sky, clear and bright when we left, turned an ominous shade of gray, clouds rolling in faster than seemed natural. By the time we reached the house, the world felt suffocatingly still. We parked down the street and approached cautiously, the house looming over us like a decaying monolith. The door creaked open on its own as we stepped onto the porch. Inside, the stench of rot was even worse than before, thick and cloying like it was clinging to the walls. "Let's make this quick," Dee muttered, pulling a flashlight from his belt. The living room was just as we'd left it, trash piles, broken furniture, and a dark stain on the carpet where the doll had sat. Except now, there was something else. In the middle of the room, scratched into the floorboards in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word. "Why?" The air grew colder, enough to make my breath visible. Dee shined his flashlight around, the beam cutting through the dimness. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping from somewhere deeper in the house. "Basement," Dee whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. I don't think I started, but Dee was already moving. The basement door stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. As we stepped closer, the thumping grew louder, echoing up the stairs like a heartbeat. Dee pushed the door open, and a draft of cold, damp air hit us. "Stay close," he said, and we descended into the dark. The flashlight beam bounced across the walls, illuminating shelves of canned goods and rusted tools. The air smelled of mildew and something fouler, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The thumping was louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. And then the light landed on it. The doll was sitting on a wooden crate, its cracked porcelain face staring directly at us. The bell around its neck jingled softly as it swayed, though there was no breeze to move it. Behind it, the wall was covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the plaster. They looked almost like writing, but the angles were all wrong, the shapes twisting and curling in ways that made my eyes water. "Is it moving?" Dee asked, his voice shaking. I couldn't answer. My throat felt like it had closed up. But as we watched, the doll's head tilted to one side, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. Dee stepped forward, raising a crowbar he'd brought from the truck. "Enough of this shit." He swung, and the crowbar connected with the doll's face, shattering the porcelain. But instead of breaking apart, the doll let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. Black ichor seeped from the cracks in its face, and the symbols on the wall began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the thumping sound. "Back! Get back!" I shouted, grabbing Dee by the arm and dragging him up the stairs. But the moment we reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The house shuddered, the floor beneath us groaning as if something massive was shifting below. Then the whispers started. They came from all around us, soft and sibilant, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear: anger, hatred, hunger. "We're leaving," Dee said, his voice breaking. "Screw this." We ran for the front door, but as we reached it, the air turned frigid, and the door slammed shut, the locks clicking into place. The whispers grew louder, rising to a cacophony that made my head feel like it was splitting apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft jingle of the bell. I turned, and there it was, the doll, standing in the middle of the hallway. Its face was gone, replaced by a gaping, black void that seemed to suck in the light around it. The bell around its neck jingled again, and I swear I felt it in my chest, like the vibrations were resonating with my heartbeat. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day in my mind. My logical brain insisted it had all been a weird coincidence, a trick of the light, stress, exhaustion, but the memory of that cracked porcelain face and the sound of the bell refused to let me rest. Then I heard it. Jingle. The sound froze me in place. I strained my ears, praying I'd imagined it. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I let out a shaky breath and turned over, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Jingle. This time it was louder. Closer. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch black, but the faint glow of the streetlight outside cast long shadows on the walls. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint outline in the corner of the room, hunched and still. My breath caught in my throat as the shape shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like it was waiting for me to notice. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, my fingers fumbling over the switch. When the light flickered on, the corner was empty. Nothing but the pile of clothes I'd left on the chair. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. I was being stupid, letting my imagination run wild. But then I felt it, a soft, cold weight pressing against the foot of my bed. I didn't dare look. The pressure moved, crawling slowly up the length of the mattress. My breath hitched as the jingling bell rang again, so close it sounded like it was right next to my ear. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw myself off the bed, grabbing the lamp and swinging it wildly in the darkness. The light shattered against the wall, plunging the room back into shadows. I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the knob. When I finally yanked it open and bolted into the hallway, the noise stopped. By morning, I convinced myself I'd had a nightmare, nothing more. I called D, hoping to hear that he'd experienced something similar, but he didn't answer. His silence only added to my unease. When I showed up for work, Pete was already in the lot, loading gear into one of the trucks. He glanced at me as I approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You look like hell," he said. "Rough night." "You could say that," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. Dee's truck was parked in its usual spot, but he was nowhere to be seen. I asked Pete if he'd called in sick, but Pete just shook his head. "Probably running late," he said. "You're solo today. Got another estate cleanout. Should be an easy one." "Easy, right?" I forced a smile, though my stomach churned with dread. The house was a modest 2-story, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The front yard was overgrown, the windows streaked with grime. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the stale air hit me like a wall. The place had been empty for years, but it still carried the faint, acrid scent of something rotting. The job was straightforward: clear out the furniture and debris, pack up anything valuable, and haul the rest to the dump. I tried to focus on the work, keeping my thoughts occupied, but the oppressive silence of the house felt like it was pressing down on me. As I was clearing out the living room, I found something strange. Tucked beneath a pile of newspapers was a photograph in a cracked frame. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl standing in front of the house. The girl was holding a doll. It wasn't just any doll. It was the doll. I dropped the frame like it had burned me, the glass shattering on the floor. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the image. The doll looked pristine in the photo, its porcelain face unbroken, its bell collar shining like new. But it was unmistakable. As I stood there, frozen, I heard it again. Jingle. The sound came from upstairs. I should have left. Called Pete. Called anyone. But something compelled me to move, as if an unseen hand was guiding me. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway at the top was dark, the air colder than it had been downstairs. The jingling grew louder, more erratic, like whatever was making the noise was moving quickly, darting from one side of the house to the other. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if nudged by a breeze. I pushed it open. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner. The chair moved slowly, creaking with each back and forth motion. On the seat was the doll. Its head was tilted to the side, the crack in its face now jagged and wide, revealing something dark and pulsing underneath. The bell around its neck jingled softly, even though the chair had stopped moving. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The doll didn't respond. But then, from the shadows behind the chair, something else moved. A hand, pale, clawed, and unnaturally long, gripped the edge of the chair, pulling itself into the faint light. My breath caught as a face emerged, twisted and grotesque, with hollow eyes that seemed to look through me. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure leaned closer to the doll, its skeletal fingers brushing the bell, making it jingle softly. "You should have left," it rasped, its voice a hollow whisper that echoed in my mind. Then the doll turned its head, and for the first time, I saw its mouth move. "Too late now," it said, its voice cold and childlike. I don't remember how I made it out of the house. One moment I was frozen in place, staring at the grotesque figure and the doll, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air on the overgrown lawn. My hands were trembling, my clothes damp with sweat. I didn't go back to work that day. I didn't even call Pete. I just drove aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Every shadow seemed to shift, every corner seemed to hold the faint sound of that infernal bell. By the time I finally got home, it was well past dark. I checked every window, every lock, and shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Exhausted but still jittery, I collapsed on the couch and stared blankly at the TV, though I couldn't focus on anything. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted upright. The room plunged into darkness. It took me a moment to realize that the sound had come from the kitchen. My pulse raced as I reached for the closest thing I could find, a heavy wrench I'd left on the coffee table from fixing a leaky pipe. The kitchen was silent when I stepped inside. Moonlight spilled through the window, glinting off the shards of a broken glass that lay on the floor. At first, I thought it might have just fallen off the counter, but then I saw the small, muddy footprints leading away from the mess. They were too small for an adult, too misshapen to be human. The wrench felt like dead weight in my hand as I followed the trail. It led me to the hallway, where the air grew colder with every step. My breaths came out in white puffs, and that damn bell began to jingle again, faint and erratic, like it was laughing at me. At the end of the hallway, the door to my bedroom was open. The trail ended there. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." But I couldn't stop myself. I stepped inside. The room was empty. At least, that's what I told myself. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the walls, and the air was so thick with cold that it felt like it was pressing against my skin. I scanned every corner, my wrench raised, ready to swing at anything that moved. Then I saw it. The doll sat on my bed, its cracked face turned toward me. The jagged fissure in its porcelain had widened, exposing more of the dark, pulsating mass beneath. The bell around its neck swayed gently, even though there was no breeze. I took a step back, my chest heaving. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The doll didn't answer. Instead, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, pooling together in the corner. From the darkness, the same skeletal figure I'd seen in the house began to emerge. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and it raised a clawed hand, pointing directly at me. "You brought this upon yourself," it rasped. Its voice wasn't loud, but it reverberated through my skull like a scream. "No," I stammered. I didn't do anything." "You looked," it said. "You stayed. And now you're marked." I felt something cold wrap around my ankle and looked down to see long, thin fingers coiling out of the shadows. I kicked and screamed, but the grip tightened, pulling me toward the dark. The doll's bell jingled wildly, a cacophony of mocking laughter. Desperate, I swung the wrench, but it passed through the shadows like smoke. The skeletal figure leaned closer, its face inches from mine, and for the first time, I saw what lay within its hollow eyes. Faces. Thousands of them, screaming silently, their mouths twisted in agony. "You will join them," it whispered. I don't know how I escaped. My next memory is of waking up on the floor of my living room, my body cold and drenched in sweat. My ankle ached where the shadow had gripped it, and when I rolled up my pant leg, I found a ring of bruises in the shape of long, spindly fingers. The doll was gone, but the fear wasn't. I quit the job that day. Told Pete I couldn't do it anymore, that I needed to move on. He didn't argue, just gave me a curt nod and wished me luck. I packed up my things and left town, determined to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the sound of the bell. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the darkness seems to press in closer than it should, I hear it again. Faint. Mocking. I try not to think about what it means, but deep down I know. I was marked. And one day, the shadows will come for me again.